Ma'am, every patient here is in pain. Wait your turn like everyone else.
Read your turn.
Ma'am, every patient here is in pain. You have to wait your turn like everyone else. Mrs. Margaret lowered her gaze toward her own trembling hands, no longer having even the strength to insist. She had been waiting for almost 4 hours in the same hallway of Dr. Frank Sullivan Community Hospital, her fractured hip throbbing beneath a thin blanket that no one had stopped to adjust properly, without a single one of the people rushing past her having stopped, even once, to ask who she really was, or whose daughter she was. All around her, the entire hospital carried her own family name in large letters over the main entrance, and not a single person in that hallway seemed to know it. 4 hours earlier, everything had begun with a quiet fall in the kitchen of a small apartment in the Pilsen neighborhood. Mrs. Margaret Sullivan was 79 years old and had been living alone in a small 2-bedroom apartment on the 2nd floor of a brick building in Chicago's Pilsen neighborhood since her husband John had died of a heart attack almost 11 years earlier. Sewing hems and repairing clothes for neighborhood residents in exchange for a few dollars each week. Exactly the same kind of modest and honest work that had supported her family through more than 5 full decades of life in that same Mexican neighborhood of the city. That February afternoon, while the icy wind struck the windows of her small apartment, and she rose with difficulty from her sewing chair to prepare something simple for dinner, she slipped on the worn linoleum floor of her kitchen, falling with considerable force that tore a sharp cry of pain from her as she felt her right hip give way beneath the weight of her own body. She remained lying on the floor for almost 40 minutes, unable to get up or reach the telephone she had left on the kitchen table, until she finally managed to drag herself far enough to touch it with the tips of her fingers and dial, with hands trembling from the pain and from the cold of the floor, the number of her lifelong neighbor, Grace Oliver. "Gracie, honey, I fell. I think I broke something. I can't get up," Margaret managed to say, her voice breaking, before Grace, alarmed, hung up the phone and ran upstairs to help her, calling emergency services herself, only seconds after finding her neighbor and friend of nearly 40 years, lying on the kitchen floor, pale, and with her face tightened by pain. The ambulance transported Margaret to Dr. Frank Sullivan Community Hospital, the medical institution closest to the Pilsen neighborhood, a 310-bed hospital that, decades earlier, had begun as a small clinic with only 6 beds founded in 1968 by a young American doctor who, according to the oldest residents of the neighborhood who still told the story with genuine nostalgia, had devoted literally every cent of his own salary and every available hour of his free time to making sure that no working family in that immigrant community would ever have to choose between paying the rent and obtaining proper medical care for their sick children. That young doctor, Dr. Frank Sullivan himself, had died 32 years earlier, at 61, from pancreatic cancer that probably would have been detected considerably earlier if he himself had undergone the same regular preventive examinations that he insisted, with such dedication, on offering free of charge to every patient at his clinic. Leaving behind a considerable institutional legacy but a practically non-existent personal estate, having devoted throughout his entire adult life every available resource to sustaining the clinic and directly caring for his neediest patients, instead of accumulating any significant personal savings for his own family. Margaret was his only daughter. Margaret remembered with particular clarity, even after 7 decades had passed since her own childhood, the nights when her father returned home after midnight, exhausted from 16 continuous hours of treating patients at the small clinic on 18th Street. Having charged, in the vast majority of those cases, absolutely nothing for his services beyond whatever families could voluntarily offer him in cash, or, on many occasions, in the form of homemade food or small reciprocal favors within the informal economy of solidarity that defined life in the neighborhood during those years. "Dad, why don't you charge those families the same amount the other doctors downtown charge?" Margaret had asked him when she was only 12 years old, after hearing her mother gently complain about the family's persistent financial difficulties, even though her father's clinic treated dozens of grateful patients every week. Because if I charged them what those doctors charge, sweetheart, half of those families would never come to see me, and their children would become seriously ill without anyone treating them in time, Frank had replied with the calm patience that defined his character. Money can be earned in many different ways over the course of a lifetime. The trust of an entire community, on the other hand, can only be built in one way, by consistently showing them that their well-being matters more than any personal profit I might make at their expense. One of the most vivid memories Margaret retained of her father's complete dedication dated back to 1971, when a severe flu epidemic struck the neighborhood during a particularly harsh winter, coinciding with a serious accident at the textile factory, where a considerable portion of the men in the neighborhood worked, producing dozens of injured people at the same time, and completely overwhelming the original small clinic. Frank, as Margaret remembered at 11 years old then, had worked without sleeping for almost 72 consecutive hours, treating both those injured in the industrial accident and children sick with the flu, categorically rejecting any suggestion that he prioritize patients with greater ability to pay over those who arrived without absolutely any financial resources available. Every person who comes through that door deserves exactly the same level of care, no matter how much money they have in their pocket, Frank had told a physician colleague who visited him during that crisis, and suggested that he establish some kind of prioritization system based on ability to pay. If I ever forget that simple truth, I want someone to remind me immediately, because it would mean I had completely lost sight of the original reason I decided to become a doctor. The original small clinic grew considerably over the following 2 decades, gradually expanding until it became a formal community hospital officially recognized by the state of Illinois, although Frank insisted throughout his active life as medical director on keeping intact the founding commitment to charitable care that had defined his first years of almost volunteer work. Barely 2 years before his death, the hospital's board of directors, in a gesture of formal recognition of his legacy, decided to officially rename the institution Dr. Frank Sullivan Community Hospital, placing a large commemorative plaque in the main lobby, together with an oil portrait capturing his serene face and characteristic white coat. However, over the decades following his death, and particularly during the last 8 years under the executive leadership of Mark Walker, an administrator with a business background but no direct personal connection to the hospital's founding history, the institution had experienced a gradual yet considerable transformation in its operational priorities, progressively moving away from the original commitment to charitable care that Frank had established with such determination decades earlier. Mark Walker, 52, had assumed executive leadership of the hospital after a substantial career in corporate healthcare administration at several private hospital chains in Illinois, arriving at Sullivan Hospital with a strategic vision focused primarily on improving the financial indicators of an institution that, as he had repeatedly argued before the board during his first years in charge, needed to modernize considerably in order to remain viable within the current competitive landscape of private healthcare. Under his direction, the hospital had invested considerable resources in constructing a new specialized cardiology wing and expanding elective cosmetic surgery services, both lines of business considerably more profitable than traditional community primary care, while at the same time the budget allocated to the charitable care program that Frank had originally established had been reduced year after year under administrative justifications that Walker presented to the board as necessary optimizations of limited resources. The free primary care clinic that Frank had personally maintained for decades, directly serving families without adequate health insurance, had been reduced under Walker's administration from 5 full days of operation each week to barely 2 shortened afternoons, with insufficient volunteer medical staff and waiting times that, according to a growing number of complaints from community patients, frequently exceeded 4 or 5 continuous hours. Dr. Walker, we need to seriously consider restoring the resources of the community primary care clinic. Patient complaints are increasing considerably, and this directly contradicts the founding values of this institution. Dr. Christine Mitchell, head of the internal medicine department and one of the few persistent voices among senior medical staff still actively defending Frank Sullivan's original legacy, had told him barely 6 months before Margaret's accident. "Dr. Mitchell, I understand your concern, but this hospital needs to generate enough revenue to sustain quality medical services for the entire community, including the primary care clinic itself in the long term. Sometimes difficult financial decisions are necessary precisely to protect the institution's overall sustainability in the future." What Walker did not openly mention to the board, or to any member of the medical staff, was that a considerable portion of the resources, optimized, away from the primary care clinic, had been redirected, through a deliberately complex budget allocation structure, toward additional executive bonuses for the senior administrative team itself, including substantial personal bonuses for Walker, directly tied to the increasing profit margins of the new cardiology wing and the elective cosmetic surgery program, information that only a detailed forensic financial analysis would eventually fully reveal. Carol Irving, a 74-year-old retired nurse who had worked directly alongside Frank Sullivan during the last 15 years of his active life as medical director, and who continued volunteering 2 days a week in the hospital's historical archives department, had watched this gradual transformation with increasing concern during the last 8 years, privately documenting, in occasional conversations with Dr. Mitchell, her own anxiety about where the institution she had helped build through decades of collective effort was heading. "Sometimes I think that if Frank could see what his original clinic has become, considering how they now treat families who cannot fully pay for their services, it would break his heart," Carol told Christine Mitchell during one of their occasional conversations in the hospital cafeteria, only weeks before Margaret suffered her serious fall. "But I also know the younger people in this hospital don't even fully know his story. To them, Frank Sullivan is simply the nice name on the sign at the entrance, not a real person who devoted absolutely everything he had to this community." The ambulance transported Margaret to the emergency department of Sullivan Hospital only 20 minutes after Grace's call, with paramedics documenting a probable hip fracture, together with obvious signs of severe pain and possible mild confusion related to moderate hypothermia, considering the prolonged time she had remained lying on the cold floor of her kitchen. However, when she reached the emergency department, which was heavily overcrowded that winter afternoon, with multiple cases of severe flu and at least 2 additional automobile accidents resulting from the dangerous weather conditions, Margaret was initially evaluated by Jessica Monroe, the triage coordinator on duty, a 34-year-old woman who had worked in that department for almost 7 years and who, as her own colleagues would later acknowledge, carried a considerable burden of accumulated professional exhaustion caused precisely by the constant reductions in staffing and resources that Walker's administration had systematically implemented during the previous years. Probable hip fracture. Approximately 80 years old, Medicaid insurance, no family companion present, Jessica noted with the mechanical efficiency of someone processing yet another similar case during an exceptionally overwhelming shift, assigning Margaret a moderate priority classification that, given the current volume of more urgent cases documented that afternoon, implied a considerable estimated waiting period before she would receive full medical attention. Margaret, seated in a wheelchair in the emergency room hallway, with the pain from her fractured hip progressively intensifying over the following hours of waiting, tried on 2 separate occasions to get the attention of nursing staff rushing past her, asking for some form of pain relief while she waited for her turn to receive a complete evaluation. "Excuse me, miss. The pain is getting considerably worse. Is there any way someone could check me soon?" Margaret asked, in a weak but still polite voice, to a nurse hurrying past while pushing a medication cart. "Ma'am, every patient here is in pain. You have to wait your turn like everyone else," the nurse replied without even fully stopping, continuing on toward another room. Almost 3 hours after her arrival, with Margaret still waiting in the same hallway, now visibly pale and trembling slightly, Jessica Monroe, reviewing the list of pending patients again during a moment of relative calm, approached her with barely concealed impatience. "Mrs. Sullivan, I need to confirm some additional information about your medical insurance before we can proceed with imaging studies to confirm the fracture. Do you have any supplemental insurance besides Medicaid?" "No, dear, only Medicaid. My husband worked in a factory, and I sewed clothes for the neighbors. We never had the resources for any insurance beyond that." Jessica processed that information with a barely contained sigh, reflecting both the accumulated exhaustion of a particularly difficult workday and a broader institutional frustration connected to the constant pressure management placed on staff to accelerate the treatment of patients with more profitable insurance. And she responded in a tone that, while not deliberately cruel, conveyed a considerable lack of consideration for Margaret's particular situation. "I understand, ma'am. I'll make a note of it, but I should warn you that with Medicaid, some additional studies may take considerably longer to be approved. We'll do what we can, but you need to be patient." A young resident passing near the area where Margaret was still waiting in her wheelchair made a comment, unaware that she could hear him clearly, to a colleague walking beside him. "Another Medicaid patient with a hip fracture. We'll be lucky if orthopedics sees her before tomorrow, considering how many privately insured cases we have pending tonight." Margaret, hearing that comment with a quiet sadness she made no attempt to express aloud, briefly closed her eyes, remembering, in the midst of her increasing physical pain, the stories her own father used to tell her about the clinic's early years, when he insisted with absolute firmness that no patient should ever wait longer, simply because of their ability to pay. Carol Irving, who happened to be working that specific afternoon in the hospital's historical archives department, preparing photographs and documents for the celebration of the 58th anniversary of the clinic's original founding, scheduled for only 2 weeks later, decided to go down to the hospital's main cafeteria for a short break, crossing on her way through the emergency room hallway where Margaret was still waiting, now almost 4 hours after her initial arrival. Something in the face of the elderly woman sitting in the wheelchair, a particular combination of quiet dignity and contained pain, caught Carol's attention as she passed near her, creating a strange sensation of partial recognition that she could not fully identify at first. She stopped and stepped back a few paces, studying more carefully the aged face that still looked remarkably similar, in certain features around the eyes and the shape of the jaw, to a photograph she had been reviewing that very morning in the hospital's historical archive. "Excuse me, ma'am, may I ask your full name?" Carol said, approaching with a genuine curiosity whose intensity she still did not completely understand. "Margaret Sullivan, dear. Margaret Sullivan Reed. Although I've been widowed for almost 11 years now." Carol felt as though her heart stopped for a moment when she heard that particular surname, processing the possibility, still uncertain but increasingly convincing given the face before her, of a connection that would prove absolutely extraordinary if confirmed. "Sullivan? Would your father happen to have been Dr. Frank Sullivan, the original founder of this very hospital?" Margaret, surprised by the specific question after nearly 4 hours of waiting, during which no one had shown any genuine interest beyond the basic administrative information required to process her case, nodded with an expression combining considerable physical exhaustion and sudden emotion at hearing her father's name spoken with such immediate recognition. "Yes, dear. My father was Dr. Frank Sullivan. He worked at this same clinic when it was still small, until the day he died." Carol, feeling tears begin to form in her own eyes, took Margaret's hand with a sudden tenderness that contrasted dramatically with the administrative coldness that had characterized the elderly woman's entire experience during the previous 4 hours. "Mrs. Sullivan, I worked directly alongside your father during the last 15 years of his life. He was the most generous and dedicated man I have ever known in my entire professional career. I cannot believe you have been sitting here waiting for hours without anyone knowing who you really were." Jessica Monroe, hearing fragments of that conversation while completing paperwork for another patient nearby, approached with growing confusion that quickly turned into genuine alarm as she understood the full magnitude of what she had just heard. "Are you saying this woman is Dr. Sullivan's daughter?" "The founder of the hospital." "Exactly, Jessica. And she has been waiting for almost 4 full hours with a confirmed hip fracture, without anyone properly prioritizing her care, precisely because people assumed, based only on her medical insurance and her appearance, that she did not deserve special consideration." Jessica, quickly processing the full implications of what she had just discovered, immediately moved toward the nearest nursing station, activating an urgent care protocol that, within minutes, completely transformed the pace at which the medical staff began moving around Margaret. I need Dr. Foster from orthopedics here immediately. And someone call Dr. Mitchell, please. Tell her it's urgent. Dr. Christine Mitchell, alerted only minutes later by an urgent call from Carol, reached the emergency department very quickly, finding Margaret already surrounded by a full medical team that, only 15 minutes earlier, had been completely absent from her specific case. Mrs. Margaret, I'm Dr. Mitchell, head of internal medicine at this hospital. I am deeply sorry that you had to wait so long before receiving the urgent care you needed, Christine said, taking Margaret's hand with genuine warmth, while simultaneously reviewing the imaging studies that had finally been completed with remarkable speed during the previous few minutes. We are going to make sure you receive absolutely the best care possible, exactly as your father would have insisted every patient in this community receive. Thank you, doctor. I wasn't expecting so much commotion simply because I'm my father's daughter. He never wanted special treatment for anyone, not even for his own family. That is precisely why, Mrs. Sullivan, it is so important that we immediately correct what happened this afternoon. Your father built this hospital on the principle that every person deserved exactly the same urgent care, no matter who they were. Discovering that you specifically went through exactly the kind of degrading weight he devoted his entire life to preventing is, honestly, devastating for me as a physician at this institution. Margaret's partial hip replacement surgery, performed that same night by Dr. Foster, the hospital's chief of orthopedics, was completely successful, with a considerably favorable recovery prognosis, given her age and relatively stable overall physical condition before the accident. During the following days of hospital recovery, Margaret received, as she would later observe with genuine discomfort, a level of personalized care considerably greater than what she had experienced during her few previous hospitalizations, with senior physicians visiting her personally each day, and Carol Irving spending many hours at her bedside, sharing detailed memories of the years she had worked alongside Frank. I don't need special treatment simply because they discovered who my father was, Carol. I'm deeply concerned, thinking about how many other women like me, without any recognizable surname, are still waiting for hours in that same hallway, without anyone treating them with the dignity they deserve. Margaret confessed to Carol during one of their long conversations while she recovered. You are absolutely right, Mrs. Margaret, and that is exactly the question we need to investigate very seriously. What happened to you should never have happened, no matter whose daughter you were, and we need to fully understand why this hospital's system allowed it to happen in such a systematic way. Dr. Mitchell, deeply disturbed by what had happened and determined to understand the full magnitude of the systemic problem that had allowed the founder's own daughter to wait for hours without adequate care, formally requested a meeting with Mark Walker only 2 days after the incident, presenting Margaret's specific case as direct evidence of a much broader institutional crisis requiring the immediate attention of the full board of directors. Mark, what happened to Mrs. Margaret Sullivan was not an isolated incident or a simple administrative mistake. It was the direct and predictable result of years of systematic cuts to the charitable care program and to the emergency staffing resources this hospital needs in order to function properly, Christine said during that formal meeting, with substantial documentation showing similar patterns of prolonged waiting disproportionately affecting low-income patients during recent years. We need a complete and independent investigation into how this hospital's financial resources have really been allocated during the last 8 years under your leadership. Walker, initially defensive toward what he regarded as an exaggerated criticism based on a single incident, eventually agreed, pressured both by Mitchell herself and by the growing media attention Margaret's case was beginning to generate within the Pilsen community, where the story of the founder's daughter waiting for hours without adequate care spread rapidly through the informal community communication networks that had defined life in the neighborhood for generations. The independent audit, formally commissioned by the hospital board only 1 week after Margaret's incident, and conducted by a firm specializing in the finances of nonprofit medical institutions, confirmed within 7 weeks exactly what Christine Mitchell had suspected, after months of careful observation. The systematic cuts to the charitable care program and emergency staffing resources during the previous 8 years had consistently, and in a way difficult to attribute to coincidence, coincided with considerable increases in executive bonuses, tied directly to the profit margins of the new cardiology wing and the elective cosmetic surgery program. The final report documented that Walker had received, during that 8-year period, accumulated personal bonuses of nearly $460,000, directly tied to the growth of those two specific business lines. While the budget of the charitable primary care clinic had been reduced by 63% during the same period, and the nursing staff assigned specifically to the emergency department had declined by 41%, despite a documented increase in the overall annual volume of patients treated. Mark, this audit confirms a systematic pattern of prioritizing personal financial gain over the well-being of the patients in this community. Exactly the opposite of everything this hospital is supposed to represent from its original founding, Christine said during the formal presentation of the report before the full board of directors, with Carol Irving also present as a witness to the direct human impact of those administrative decisions. Walker, facing the full documentary evidence, still tried to defend himself. Every decision I made was intended to guarantee this hospital's long-term financial sustainability. Without the cardiology wing and without the cosmetic surgery program, there would not even be a budget to discuss today. Financial sustainability of $460,000 in your own pocket, Mark, Barbara Sterling replied without raising her voice. Don't sell us sustainability. Sell us honesty, if you still have any of that left. Walker found no answer to that sentence, and the silence that followed, considerably longer than any previous pause during that meeting, confirmed to everyone present that his defense had been completely exhausted. The decisions you made during these 8 years do not reflect prudent and necessary financial management, Mr. Walker. They reflect a systematic prioritization of your own personal benefit over the well-being of the community this hospital exists to serve, declared the board chairwoman, Barbara Sterling, who had personally known Frank Sullivan during the final years of his life. Your contract is terminated effective immediately, and we will proceed with additional legal action related to the restitution of funds that we consider to have been misappropriated through this bonus structure, directly tied to the improper reduction of essential charitable services. Barely 2 weeks after Walker's formal departure, the board appointed Christine Mitchell as the hospital's new interim executive director, with the explicit mandate to fully restore the resources and operational priorities that had defined Frank Sullivan's original founding vision, an appointment Christine accepted on the specific condition that Carol Irving formally joined the leadership team as permanent advisor on institutional values and the hospital's historical memory. I don't want to lead this institution based only on my own interpretation of what Dr. Sullivan would have wanted, Christine explained during her first formal meeting as interim executive director. I want Carol, who worked directly beside him for years, to be present for every important decision we make, from this point forward, so we can make sure we never again move as far away from our founding values as we did during the last 8 years. Jessica Monroe, processing during the following weeks both her own personal responsibility for the inappropriate treatment of Margaret and the broader systemic context of insufficient resources that had defined her professional experience for years under Walker's administration, requested a private meeting with Christine Mitchell barely 1 month after Christine formally assumed her new leadership role. Dr. Mitchell, I need to apologize personally for the way I treated Mrs. Margaret that afternoon. I know that understaffing does not completely excuse my own lack of empathy in that specific moment, and I've thought about it a great deal during the last few weeks. Jessica, I deeply appreciate that honesty. And while it is true that you need to take personal responsibility for how you treated Mrs. Margaret in that particular moment, I also recognize that you worked for years under systemic conditions designed precisely to create exactly that kind of failure in patient care. I'm not going to pretend that both things are not true at the same time. Christine, carefully considering how to address Jessica's situation within the broader context of institutional restructuring, decided, instead of proceeding with severe disciplinary measures, to offer her a specific role within the new Patient Experience Improvement Committee she was forming, precisely because she considered the direct perspective of someone who had personally experienced the systemic pressures of chronic understaffing valuable for designing genuinely effective solutions. I want you to help design the new triage protocols we're implementing, Jessica, precisely because you understand from your own direct experience exactly what kinds of pressures lead to rushed or insensitive decisions when staff are overloaded. We need those protocols to protect both patients and the nursing staff itself from impossible situations like the ones you faced for years. Jessica accepted that responsibility with a genuine determination to make a positive contribution after her personal mistake, and, during the following months, collaborated in designing a new triage system that incorporated guaranteed maximum waiting times regardless of the patient's type of medical insurance, together with automatic alerts notifying senior supervisors whenever any patient, regardless of the initial medical priority classification, exceeded 2 full hours of waiting without an additional evaluation. This system would have completely prevented what happened to Mrs. Margaret, whether anyone recognized her last name or not, Jessica explained during the formal presentation of the new protocol to the entire emergency staff. And that is exactly the most important lesson I learned from all of this. A patient's dignity should never depend on someone happening to recognize who they really are. It should be a guaranteed right for every person who walks through that door, without a single exception. The charitable primary care clinic, fully restored to its original schedule of 5 complete days each week, with properly assigned medical and nursing staff, formally reopened only 3 months after Walker's departure, with Margaret, now considerably recovered from her hip surgery and walking again with the help of a walker, attending the reopening ceremony as guest of honor, a role she had initially accepted with considerable reluctance, but eventually recognized as an appropriate way to honor the full memory of her father. Dad never sought public recognition for what he did, and I don't seek it for myself either, Margaret said during her brief speech at the reopening ceremony, with Carol affectionately holding her arm while she spoke. But if my story helps this hospital permanently remember why it truly exists, then everything I went through that very difficult afternoon was worth it. Among the first families to benefit from the restored clinic was the Barnes family, headed by Yvonne Barnes, a 36-year-old working mother employed at a local Pilsen restaurant without any health insurance benefits, whose 7-year-old son Ethan had developed persistent symptoms of severe asthma that, under Walker's previous administration, would have required entire weeks of waiting to obtain an appointment with a pediatric pulmonology specialist, a delay that, given the progressive severity of the child's symptoms, would have represented a considerable medical risk. Under the old system, we probably would have ended up in the emergency room with a severe respiratory crisis before we could get a regular appointment, Yvonne told Christine Mitchell during Ethan's first full consultation at the restored clinic, where he received both an immediate medical evaluation and a complete treatment plan at no direct cost. Thanks to the clinic being open every day of the week again, my son received the diagnosis and treatment he needed before the situation became considerably worse. Mrs. Margaret, who over time had begun visiting the restored clinic regularly as an informal volunteer, offering companionship and comforting conversation to patients waiting their turn, particularly other older residents of the neighborhood, who eventually came to recognize both her own name and the full historical meaning represented by her presence within that same institution, developed a particular affection for Ethan during his regular medical follow-up visits. Your grandpa, well, he wasn't really your grandpa, but he was almost like the grandfather of this whole neighborhood, built this clinic so children like you would always receive the care they need, without their mothers having to worry about money, Margaret explained to Ethan during one of his follow-up visits, showing him an old photograph of Frank that she had carried in her wallet for decades. Barbara Sterling, chairwoman of the hospital board, working closely with Christine Mitchell during the months following Walker's departure, led the implementation of a considerably more robust governance structure, specifically designed to prevent future executive directors from ever again manipulating the resources of the charitable care program in the way Walker had managed to do for 8 full years without timely detection. We need to make sure that no future executive director, no matter how persuasive their arguments about financial sustainability may be, can ever again erode the fundamental resources of this clinic without substantial direct community oversight, Barbara explained during the formal presentation of the new governance structure before the full board. The new structure, formalized only 6 months after Walker's departure, established a mandatory minimum of 15% of the hospital's annual operating revenue to be permanently allocated to the charitable care program, a figure that could only be modified through a qualified 2/3 vote of the full board, including the required affirmative vote of at least 3 direct community representatives specifically elected by residents of the Pilsen neighborhood, precisely to ensure that the voice of the community benefiting from the program held effective veto authority over any future attempt to reduce that founding commitment. Carol Irving, formally assuming her new role as permanent advisor on institutional values, also established a mandatory historical orientation program for every new employee hired by the hospital, including a personal guided visit to the Historical Archives Department, where she shared, with the same genuine passion that had characterized her entire professional career, the complete story of Frank Sullivan and of the founding principles that had given birth to the entire institution. Every person who works here needs to understand, from their first day, that this is not simply a successful hospital with a nice name over the entrance, Carol explained during each orientation session. It is an institution built, literally, through the personal sacrifice of a man who gave absolutely everything he had to make sure this community never lacked dignified medical care. I hope every one of you carries that history with you every day you work within these walls. Walker's case, in addition to the immediate administrative consequences within the hospital itself, also generated an additional investigation by the Illinois Department of Public Health, given the regulatory implications of systematically reducing charitable care services within an institution that maintains specific tax benefits precisely because of its declared commitment to that kind of community care. The state investigation, completed only 8 months after it began, confirmed significant violations of the minimum charitable care requirements the institution was required to maintain in order to preserve its preferred tax status, resulting in additional administrative sanctions against Walker himself, including a temporary 5-year prohibition from holding any executive position within nonprofit medical institutions regulated by the state of Illinois. Robert Reed, Margaret's only son, who had lived in Milwaukee for almost 20 years while working as a supervisor at an industrial plant, arrived in Chicago only 2 days after his mother's original accident, feeling considerable guilt for not having been present during the most difficult hours of waiting in the emergency department, although Margaret, with the same characteristic generosity that had defined her entire life, categorically refused to allow her son to carry that unjustified sense of guilt. "You couldn't have known what was going to happen, Robert. You live almost 2 hours away, and I called Grace first because she was closer. There is absolutely no reason for you to feel guilty about circumstances that were completely beyond your control." Robert, however, after directly witnessing during his visit the institutional transformation the hospital was undergoing because his mother's case had been exposed, decided to become actively involved in creating an additional fund specifically intended to help families of older adults in the Pilsen neighborhood who, like his own mother, lived alone and faced particular difficulties obtaining rapid emergency medical care without the immediate presence of relatives who could actively advocate for them during crisis situations. "I want to create something that specifically helps older people who live alone, like my mother, so they never again have to wait for hours in a hallway without anyone actively defending their urgent medical needs," Robert explained to Christine Mitchell during a meeting where he formally proposed the creation of that additional program. The Senior Adult Companion Program, established with initial funding personally provided by Robert and later supplemented with additional resources from the hospital itself, assigned trained community volunteers specifically to accompany and actively advocate for elderly patients who arrived at the emergency department without immediate family accompaniment, ensuring that their medical needs received appropriate follow-up and that any significant delay in their care was immediately communicated to senior medical supervisors. This program exists directly because of what happened to my mother, and I sincerely hope no other family ever has to go through the same worry I felt when I finally arrived and found her still waiting, in pain, without anyone having properly prioritized her care," Robert said during the formal announcement of the program, held only 5 months after his mother's original accident. The celebration of the 58th anniversary of the clinic's original founding initially scheduled for only 2 weeks after Margaret's accident, was ultimately postponed for almost 3 additional months, allowing it to coincide, in a considerably more meaningful way, with the complete reopening of the charitable primary care clinic and the formal implementation of the new community governance structure. The ceremony, held in the hospital's main lobby beside the same oil portrait of Frank Sullivan that Carol had been preparing display materials for on the particular afternoon when she first recognized Margaret, brought together hundreds of Pilsen residents, including numerous families Frank had personally treated decades earlier and who still retained vivid memories of his characteristic generosity. Margaret, once again invited as a central figure in the ceremony, decided this time to share, in considerably greater detail than during the clinic reopening months earlier, the complete story of her own childhood with her father, including the specific memory of the 1971 flu epidemic and the 72 continuous hours Frank had worked without rest to treat both those injured in the industrial accident and the sick children of the community. My father never wanted a large hospital built with his name over the entrance. He simply wanted no family in this neighborhood ever to have to choose between paying the rent and taking their sick children to a doctor, Margaret said before the gathered crowd, with Robert beside her and Carol affectionately holding her hand. During a very painful moment in my own life, that specific lesson he always defended so firmly was almost completely lost inside this institution. I am deeply grateful that my own experience, painful as it was, served to remind all of you exactly why this hospital truly exists. Christine Mitchell, just formally confirmed as the hospital's permanent executive director after successfully completing her 6-month interim period, used that same ceremony to publicly announce the creation of the Frank Sullivan Scholarship, an educational program specifically intended for young people from the Pilsen neighborhood interested in pursuing careers in medicine or nursing, funded through a specific portion of the 15% of operating revenue now permanently protected under the new governance structure. We want the next generation of doctors and nurses who work in this hospital to come directly from this same community, exactly as Frank Sullivan always dreamed would happen, Christine said during the formal announcement of the scholarship. No one understands the specific needs of a community better than someone who grew up entirely within it. Among the first beneficiaries of that scholarship was Claire Reed, Margaret's granddaughter and Robert's daughter, who, just finishing high school in Milwaukee, had decided, after witnessing firsthand the entire institutional transformation that followed her own grandmother's accident, to study nursing with the specific intention of eventually returning to work at the same hospital that carried her great-grandfather's name. I grew up hearing stories about my great-grandfather Frank, but I never fully understood the real impact he had until I saw firsthand how his memory helped completely transform this hospital after what happened to my grandmother, Claire explained to Christine Mitchell during the ceremony where she formally received the first full scholarship awarded under the new program. I want to become the kind of nurse who treats every patient with exactly the same dignity my great-grandfather always insisted on offering, no matter who they really are or how much money they have. During the following years, Margaret, completely recovered from her hip fracture, although now permanently walking with the help of a cane, became a constant and genuinely beloved presence within Sullivan Hospital, visiting the charitable primary care clinic almost every working day, not as a patient but as an informal volunteer who offered comforting companionship and patient conversation to other elderly residents of the neighborhood waiting their turn, many of whom eventually came to know her simply as Mrs. Margaret, without necessarily immediately connecting her constant presence to the particular story of recognition that had transformed the entire institution so profoundly. I never set out to become some kind of symbol of this hospital, Carol, but I have to admit there is something deeply satisfying about spending my days here, surrounded by the same community my father devoted his entire life to serving, Margaret told Carol, during one of their usual conversations in the clinic waiting room, already several years after the original incident. Your father would be deeply proud, Margaret, not only of how your own experience helped correct the direction of this institution, but of how you chose to spend the years afterward actively contributing, instead of simply passively accepting the recognition you finally received. Claire Reed, successfully completing her bachelor's degree in nursing, only 4 years after receiving her original scholarship, formally fulfilled the promise she had made during the anniversary ceremony, returning to Sullivan Hospital to begin her professional career in exactly the same internal medicine department where Christine Mitchell, still leading the institution with the same meticulous dedication she had demonstrated since her original appointment, personally welcomed her on her first official day of work. "It is an absolute privilege to have you here, Claire, knowing exactly the complete family history represented by your presence inside this hospital," Christine told her during that formal welcome. "I hope that during your own career here, you find the same kind of genuine purpose that both your great-grandfather and your grandmother demonstrated, each in their own particular way, through entire decades of deep connection with this same institution." Jessica Monroe, continuing her work on the Patient Experience Improvement Committee for several additional years, eventually developed a particular specialization in empathetic communication protocols for nursing staff working under high-pressure conditions, ultimately publishing, in collaboration with Dr. Mitchell herself, a best practices manual that other community hospitals in the Chicago region began adopting as a reference for improving their own triage systems and communication with vulnerable patients. "My own mistake with Mrs. Margaret eventually became the basis of work that I hope will help prevent similar mistakes in hospitals throughout the region," Jessica told Claire during one of their first weeks working together in the emergency department. "Sometimes the most painful moments of our own careers end up teaching us exactly the lessons we needed in order to become better healthcare professionals." The complete case of Sullivan Hospital, extensively documented by a regional Chicago newspaper, interested in investigating broader patterns of erosion of charitable services within community hospitals throughout the region, generated considerable public attention during the months after publication, positioning Margaret's story and the subsequent institutional transformation as a case study frequently cited in discussions of ethical hospital governance and of the specific risks of allowing executive financial incentives to operate without sufficient direct community oversight. "I never sought to have my personal story become a national case study on public health policy, but if that helps other communities better protect their own community hospitals against the kind of erosion that almost completely destroyed my father's legacy, then I am deeply glad it spread so widely," Margaret commented during an interview with that same regional newspaper, barely 2 years after the original incident. Barbara Sterling, continuing her leadership as chairwoman of the board for several additional years, worked actively with patient rights advocacy organizations throughout Illinois to promote additional state legislation strengthening financial transparency requirements for nonprofit community hospitals, specifically designed to prevent executive bonus structures from encouraging, as had occurred under Walker, the systematic reduction of essential charitable care services. Mrs. Margaret's case taught us that institutional goodwill, no matter how genuine it may be at the time of the institution's original founding, is always vulnerable if there is not enough structural transparency and enough direct community oversight capable of detecting gradual deviations before they become open crises. Barbara testified before the Health Committee of the Illinois State Legislature during the hearings that preceded the passage of that new hospital financial transparency legislation. That legislation, finally approved almost 3 years after Margaret's original incident, required all nonprofit community hospitals in Illinois to publish annual detailed reports on the specific proportion of their operating revenue devoted to charitable care, together with complete documentation of any executive bonus structure tied to specific financial metrics, generating a level of public transparency that, as multiple health policy advocates acknowledged during the legislative process, would have made it considerably more difficult for someone like Walker to operate for 8 full years without timely detection. Ethan Barnes, the child who had received timely treatment for his severe asthma shortly after the reopening of the primary care clinic, developed over the following years a special relationship of affection and gratitude toward Mrs. Margaret, who continued visiting him regularly during his medical follow-up appointments and closely following his healthy growth year after year. "Mrs. Margaret, when I grow up, I want to be a doctor, like Claire's great-grandfather," Ethan confessed to her when he was already 12, during one of his routine follow-up visits several years after his initial treatment. "I want to help children like me who get sick and don't have much money to pay the doctor. That would make my father very happy, Ethan. And if you ever decide to follow that path, I want you to know that this hospital, and the Frank Sullivan Scholarship specifically, will be here waiting for you. Exactly as they were waiting for Claire when she decided to follow that same path. Yvonne Barnes, Ethan's mother, who over time had begun collaborating as a regular volunteer on the Community Oversight Committee for the Charitable Care Program, one of the 3 community seats formally established within the hospital's new governance structure, found in that volunteer work a genuine way to give something back for the care her own son had received during a particularly vulnerable moment in their family life. I never imagined I would end up sitting in formal hospital board meetings, helping decide how charitable care resources are distributed, Yvonne told Barbara Sterling during one of the committee's mandatory quarterly meetings. But after what this hospital did for my son, when it finally worked the way it is always supposed to work, I felt it was my responsibility to help make sure it continued working that way for the next families that need exactly the same kind of urgent care. Christine Mitchell, by then having led the hospital for almost 8 full years since her formal appointment as permanent executive director, oversaw, near the 66th anniversary of the clinic's original founding, another considerable expansion of the community primary care wing, including the addition of accessible mental health services and specific chronic disease management programs for the neighborhood's older adult population, directly responding to needs that Margaret's own experience had helped identify as particularly underserved within the traditional hospital care model. Mrs. Margaret taught us, without deliberately setting out to do so, that the needs of our older patients require considerably more than simply occasional emergency medical care, Christine explained, during the formal presentation of that new service expansion. They need companionship, they need continuous follow-up, and they need to feel that someone truly cares about their overall well-being, not merely about resolving individual medical crises after it is already too late to prevent them. Claire Reed, in her 7th full year working as a nurse at Sullivan Hospital, decided, with enthusiastic support from both Christine Mitchell and Carol Irving herself, to begin additional advanced nursing studies specializing in geriatrics, motivated specifically by her close family experience and by her genuine desire to contribute directly to the new chronic disease management program for older adults that the hospital had recently established. I want to specialize in exactly the kind of care my own grandmother needed that afternoon when no one attended to her properly, Claire explained to Christine during the conversation in which she formally communicated her decision to continue her specialized studies. I want to make sure no other older adult in this community ever has to wait for hours without anyone fully understanding their particular needs. Margaret, now 86, but maintaining, according to the regular medical reports from her own checkups fully covered by the charitable fund, remarkably stable health considering her advanced age, continued her constant presence within the primary care clinic for several more years, eventually becoming something of a living institution within the hospital itself, recognized and beloved both by permanent medical staff and by successive generations of neighborhood families who arrived seeking medical care and also found her comforting companionship during inevitable waiting periods. Every time I see Mrs. Margaret sitting in that same chair by the waiting room window, I feel as though I somehow see Dr. Sullivan himself still present in this hospital, personally caring for this community, exactly as he did throughout his life, Coral said during another interview with the same regional newspaper that had originally documented the entire story, only a few months before Carol herself finally decided to retire completely from her active volunteer role after almost 50 full years of uninterrupted connection with the institution, first as a formal nurse and later as a dedicated volunteer in the Historical Archives Department. At Carol's farewell ceremony, attended by dozens of neighborhood families and practically all of the hospital's senior medical staff, Margaret, still strong enough to say a few brief words publicly, formally thanked the woman whose careful observation on that particular afternoon had so decisively changed the entire direction of the institution her father had built. Carol recognized my last name when no one else had even bothered to ask it. That small gesture of genuine attention, considerably smaller than any formal administrative decision, ended up literally saving everything my father built with so much personal sacrifice. Margaret said during the ceremony. "I hope her example always reminds all of us that genuine attention to people begins with small gestures like that, not only with major institutional reforms." Margaret Sullivan died peacefully, at 91, in her own bed in the small Pilsen apartment where she had lived for more than 5 full decades, with Robert, Claire, and several close neighbors, including Grace Oliver, present during her final hours, 12 full years after that devastating afternoon when no one at the hospital bearing her own father's name had believed she deserved timely medical attention. Her funeral, held at the same community church in Pilsen, where she had been an active parishioner throughout her entire adult life, drew a considerable attendance that tangibly reflected the full magnitude of the impact her story had generated within the community. Entire families who had benefited from the restored clinic, current and retired medical staff from Sullivan Hospital, including Christine Mitchell, Jessica Monroe, and a considerably older Carol Irving who was still present to say goodbye to the woman whose accidental recognition had changed the entire course of their own professional lives, as well as dozens of neighborhood residents who had known her simply as Mrs. Margaret for years, without necessarily knowing all the specific details of the story that had defined her broader public recognition. Claire, delivering the principal eulogy at her own grandmother's funeral, shared a final reflection that captured, with considerable eloquence, the complete meaning of Margaret's entire life, not merely the specific moment of recognition that had defined her best-known public story. "My grandmother lived 91 full years, and only during the last 12 of those years did she receive the kind of public recognition her family history deserved. But I want all of you to understand something important. My grandmother never needed that recognition to know exactly who she was, or to live with the same quiet dignity that defined every day of her life, long before anyone recognized her last name in a hospital hallway. She sewed clothes for her neighbors, cared for her own children with absolute dedication, and treated every person she knew with exactly the same genuine respect her own father demonstrated throughout his entire medical career. The late recognition she finally received simply confirmed publicly something that had been true throughout her entire life." Sullivan Hospital, barely 2 weeks after the funeral, formally announced the installation of a second commemorative plaque in the main lobby, placed directly beside the original portrait of Frank Sullivan and dedicated specifically to Margaret's memory, with an inscription Claire had personally helped draft, reflecting the same spirit of quiet dignity that had defined both her father's life and her own entire life. This plaque honors Margaret Sullivan Reed, daughter of our founder, whose quiet dignity, even during the most difficult moment of her own life, permanently reminded us why this hospital exists. May every person who walks through these doors always receive exactly the same respect she deserved from the beginning, without anyone needing to recognize their last name before offering it. Christine Mitchell read aloud during the installation ceremony for the second plaque, before an audience that included Robert, Claire, and numerous members of the community who had come to regard Margaret, during her final years, as an additional maternal figure in their own daily lives. Ethan Barnes, fulfilling the promise he had made during childhood to someday become a physician, was accepted, only 3 years after Margaret's death, into the University of Illinois Chicago College of Medicine, with complete financial support from the Frank Sullivan Scholarship, becoming the third beneficiary of that program to successfully advance into full formal medical studies, following the path Claire had opened years earlier within nursing, and that other young people in the program had also begun to follow toward different medical specialties. "When I graduate, I want to specialize in pediatric pulmonology, exactly the kind of doctor who treated me when I was a child, thanks to this hospital finally working the way it is always supposed to work," Ethan told Christine Mitchell during the ceremony where he formally received his full scholarship. "And when I finish my training, I want to come back right here, to Sullivan Hospital, to care for the next generation of children from this same community." Yvonne Barnes, still actively serving as a member of the Community Oversight Committee more than a decade after her first volunteer participation, felt that her own son's complete journey, from that child with severe asthma waiting for timely treatment, to a young aspiring physician formally benefiting from the scholarship bearing the hospital founder's name, represented, far more eloquently than any formal institutional report, the genuine and lasting success of the entire transformation that had begun with Margaret's own experience years earlier. I never imagined, that afternoon when I brought Ethan to his first appointment at the newly restored clinic, that we would end up here more than a decade later, watching him begin his own medical studies, thanks precisely to that same institution, Yvonne told Barbara Sterling during one of the community committee's quarterly meetings. I think that demonstrates exactly the kind of generational impact a hospital genuinely committed to its community can create when it finally functions the way it is supposed to. Claire Reed, successfully completing her advanced specialization in geriatric nursing, formally assumed, around her 12th full year working at Sullivan Hospital, the role of lead coordinator for the Chronic Disease Management Program for older adults, leading a complete team of specialized nurses dedicated specifically to ensuring that no elderly patient from the Pilsen neighborhood would ever have to experience the same kind of degrading weight that had so painfully defined her own grandmother's original experience. Every decision we make within this program, from the specific communication protocols to the guaranteed maximum waiting times, exists directly because of what happened to my grandmother, Claire explained during a formal presentation of the program to a group of visiting hospital administrators from other cities interested in replicating the specific community geriatric care model Sullivan Hospital had developed during the years following the original crisis with Walker. The community geriatric care model developed by Claire and her team, formally documented in a second best practices manual, complementing Jessica Monroe's original work on empathetic communication protocols, began, around the 15th full anniversary of the hospital's institutional restoration, to attract the attention of public health administrators from other Midwestern cities interested in replicating the specific protected community governance model an LA Sullivan Hospital had successfully developed during the years following the crisis with Walker. Christine Mitchell, still leading the entire institution with the same steady dedication she had demonstrated since her original appointment, accepted, during those same years, an additional role as a volunteer advisor to several community hospitals in Milwaukee, Detroit, and Cleveland that were facing similar challenges of gradual erosion of their own founding charitable commitments, sharing in considerable detail both the specific mistakes that had allowed Walker to operate without consequence for 8 full years, and the concrete structural solutions Sullivan Hospital had successfully implemented to prevent similar situations in the future. Every time I help another community hospital establish governance structures similar to ours, I feel that we are honoring exactly the same principle Frank Sullivan established more than 6 decades ago, Christine explained, during one of those volunteer consulting conferences held in Detroit. That no business, no matter how commercially successful it may be, should ever lose sight of its fundamental commitment to the specific community it is supposed to serve. Robert Reed, continuing his own constant commitment to the senior adult companion program he had originally founded in memory of his mother's experience, gradually expanded that program into a considerably broader network of trained community volunteers, including, toward his final years before his own retirement from work in Milwaukee, the training of similar volunteer coordinators at 3 additional community hospitals in the Chicago metropolitan area that had adopted the same community companion model for elderly patients without family members present during medical emergencies. My mother never tried to become the catalyst for this much broader movement of community hospital reform, but I think she would be deeply proud to know that her own experience, as painful as it was at the time, ended up generating an impact that goes considerably beyond the original boundaries of a single hospital in Pilsen, Robert said during another interview years later, for a regional documentary about ethical institutional transformation within community healthcare in the American Midwest. Ethan Barnes, successfully completing his medical residency in pediatric pulmonology only 9 years after his original acceptance to medical school, formally fulfilled the promise he had made during his scholarship ceremony, returning to Sullivan Hospital to join the institution's permanent medical staff, in exactly the same department where, years earlier, as only a child, he had received the timely treatment that had completely changed the course of his own family life. I never forgot the promise I made to Mrs. Margaret, even though she is no longer here to see it fully fulfilled, Ethan told Yvonne, his own mother, during his first official week working as a staff physician at the hospital. But I know she would be deeply proud to know that I came back exactly here, to serve the same community that raised me, with the same dignity she always associated with her father's legacy. Claire, by then the lead coordinator of the Chronic Disease Management Program and carrying substantial experience accumulated over almost 2 full decades of work within the hospital, naturally became a kind of informal mentor to Ethan during his first months of formal clinical practice, sharing with him, with the same genuine passion Carol had demonstrated for decades, the complete details of the institutional history that defined Sullivan Hospital's entire identity. It's strange to think, Claire, that almost 20 years ago, you and I were, each in our own way, direct beneficiaries of the same institutional crisis that nearly destroyed this hospital completely. Ethan commented during one of his first extended conversations with Claire about the shared history that connected them. And now we're here together, working in the same institution, trying to make sure that history never repeats itself. That is exactly the most important lesson we learned, Ethan. Genuine institutional protection never depends on one person or one generation. It depends on every new generation of doctors, nurses, and administrators deeply understanding why this institution exists and being willing to actively defend those values, even when doing so feels uncomfortable or difficult in the specific moment they are living through. On the 78th anniversary of the clinic's original founding, which also coincided with the exact 20th anniversary of the decisive incident involving Margaret, the hospital organized a celebration considerably larger than any previous commemorative ceremony, including the formal expansion of the small community museum in the main lobby into a complete educational section dedicated specifically to documenting both Frank Sullivan's founding history and the crisis and subsequent transformation that had so profoundly defined the institution's entire direction during the 2 decades that had passed since then. Christine Mitchell, still leading the entire institution after nearly 20 full years of continuous leadership since her original appointment as interim executive director, delivered, during that particularly significant anniversary ceremony, a speech that captured, with the wisdom accumulated through 2 complete decades of institutional reconstruction, the deeper meaning of the entire journey that had defined those years. 20 years ago, this institution almost completely lost the direction its own founder had established through so much personal sacrifice, precisely because we allowed short-term financial pressures to take priority over the founding values that should have guided every important decision we made, Christine said, before the crowd gathered in the renovated main lobby. We learned, in the most painful way possible, that no institution, no matter how noble its original founding intentions may be, can completely protect itself against corruption without robust structures of transparency and without the active commitment of every successive generation of people willing to honestly confront any deviation from those essential values. Claire, listening to that speech from her place among Ethan, Jessica Monroe, still actively working within the hospital more than 2 full decades after the original incident, and dozens of other people whose lives had been transformed in one way or another by the institution's crisis and later reconstruction, felt that the complete story of public humiliation transformed into a catalyst for lasting institutional reform, which had begun with her own grandmother's devastating experience 20 years earlier, finally reached, in that moment of genuine community celebration, its fullest and most hopeful expression for all future generations who would continue benefiting from the complete legacy that both Frank and Margaret Sullivan had helped protect, each in their own particular way, but both guided by the same fundamental principle of shared human dignity. "Do you know what the strangest thing about this whole story is, Ethan?" Claire said to her colleague that same afternoon, as the two of them looked at the 2 commemorative plaques placed together in the main lobby, Frank's and Margaret's. "My great-grandfather spent his whole life building something based on genuine dignity, never seeking any specific public recognition for himself. And my grandmother, decades later, without consciously intending to, ended up saving that same legacy simply by being herself, with the same quiet dignity he always demonstrated, even during the most painful moment of her entire life." That same afternoon, after the official 78th anniversary celebration ended and the gathered crowd finally dispersed, Claire walked alone for several minutes through the third-floor hallway where, 20 years earlier, her own grandmother had waited for almost 4 complete hours without receiving the urgent medical care she desperately needed. The hallway, considerably renovated during the decades that had passed since then, now included a small, discreet sign, placed years earlier at Carol's own suggestion, marking the exact spot where the decisive recognition had occurred, with a simple inscription that read, "Here, a person's dignity never depended on who they turned out to be." Claire stopped in front of that small sign, thinking about the complete distance traveled from that devastating afternoon to the present moment of genuine institutional celebration, and about the responsibility she now felt, together with Ethan and every new generation of doctors and nurses joining the hospital, to permanently protect the values both her great-grandfather and her own grandmother had helped establish, each through a considerably different path, but always guided by the same fundamental principle of unconditional human respect. She thought about Carol, whose careful observation and meticulous institutional memory had been decisive in making the entire transformation possible, about Christine Mitchell, whose steady leadership over 2 complete decades had genuinely protected and expanded that legacy, about Jessica Monroe, whose own personal transformation after a genuine mistake had ultimately produced protocols protecting vulnerable patients in hospitals throughout the region, and about her own grandmother Margaret, whose quiet dignity, sustained even during the most painful moment of her entire life, had ultimately become the most powerful catalyst of the entire movement of institutional reform. The afternoon sun began filtering through the hallway windows while Claire remained standing in front of that small commemorative sign, feeling, with a certainty that no longer required any additional external validation to sustain itself fully, that all the complexity of that complete family story, the original founding by Frank based on absolute personal sacrifice, the gradual erosion of those values under later administrations less committed to them, her own grandmother's devastating public humiliation, and the patient reconstruction sustained for 2 complete decades, had finally resolved into something that went far beyond any specific administrative crisis. A hospital that continued serving the most vulnerable families in its community, with the same genuine dignity as always, now protected generation after generation by robust institutional structures and by a shared ethical commitment that no future crisis, regardless of its potential magnitude, could ever completely erode the way it had almost happened under Walker's administration. Because in the end, after 20 full years of sustained reflection on every detail of that story, Claire understood that the deepest lesson of the entire experience was not limited only to the importance of establishing robust governance structures capable of preventing future institutional erosion, even though that specific structural protection had undoubtedly been absolutely decisive to the hospital's sustained success during the 2 decades that had passed since the original crisis. The broader and more lasting lesson had to do with something considerably more fundamental about the very nature of institutional memory. No institution, no matter how noble its original founding values may be, could ever genuinely maintain those values across successive generations without the constant and deliberate work of actively transmitting that history, with all of its specific human details, to every new person who became part of the institution. Frank Sullivan had built something extraordinary based on absolute personal sacrifice, but that legacy, without the active memory maintained by people like Carol over entire decades, had come close to being completely lost under the management of someone who simply saw his name as a nice sign over the entrance, with no genuine understanding of the real human sacrifice that name represented. Margaret, without consciously intending to, had reminded an entire institution, through the specific pain of her own personal experience, exactly why that active memory was so absolutely essential to protecting any genuine institutional legacy against the gradual and imperceptible forgetting that, given enough time, could completely erode even the noblest and best-intentioned founding values. Grace Oliver, the neighbor whose emergency call had set in motion, without her knowing it at the time, that entire extraordinary chain of events, remained during the following years a constant presence in the lives of Robert and Claire, maintaining the same genuine friendship that had defined her relationship with Margaret through more than 4 full decades of shared neighborhood life in the same Pilsen building. I never imagined that terrifying afternoon when I found Margaret lying on her kitchen floor, that I was witnessing only the beginning of a story that would end up completely transforming an entire hospital. Grace told Claire during one of the regular visits Claire continued making to the building where her grandmother had lived for decades, even years after Margaret's death. I simply did what any neighbor would have done, called the ambulance and stayed with her until help arrived. I never thought such a simple gesture would end up creating such a large impact. That simple gesture, Grace, was exactly the first link in a whole chain of decisions that ultimately protected my great-grandfather's entire legacy, Claire replied. Sometimes the most important actions of our lives are precisely the simplest ones, the things we do without thinking very much about their future consequences, simply because we feel they are the right thing to do in that particular moment. The educational section of the Community Museum, formally expanded during the 78th anniversary celebration, included among its permanent exhibits a complete interactive timeline documenting both Frank Sullivan's founding years and the specific governance crisis under Walker, designed specifically so that students from local schools visiting the hospital as part of community educational field trips could understand, in an accessible and age-appropriate way, both the importance of institutional ethical vigilance and the tangible impact that seemingly abstract administrative decisions could have on the real lives of specific families within their own community. Fiona Sterling, Barbara Sterling's daughter and a high school teacher from the Pilsen neighborhood itself, began, around the 22nd year after the original crisis, formally incorporating the complete story of Sullivan Hospital into the social studies curriculum of her own classroom, using the specific case as a practical example for teaching her teenage students broader concepts of civic responsibility, ethical governance, and the power active community memory could exercise in protecting important institutions. My students are always deeply moved when they learn that the woman who was almost completely ignored in that hospital hallway turned out to be the founder's own daughter, Fiona commented during another interview for the regional documentary about institutional transformation. I think that specific lesson, about not judging people's value by their outward appearance, and about the importance of every institution keeping its own historical memory alive, resonates deeply, even with teenagers who are still forming their own ideas about justice and community responsibility. Ethan, during his first full years as a staff physician at the hospital, developed, with Christine Mitchell's enthusiastic support, an additional program specifically designed to identify early symptoms of asthma and other chronic respiratory diseases among children in the Pilsen neighborhood, conducting regular free screenings directly at local elementary schools, precisely the kind of early preventive intervention that, as he often reflected, could have considerably prevented his own childhood respiratory crisis if it had existed during his own early years. I want to identify the next Ethans in this community before their symptoms become severe enough to require emergency treatment, exactly as happened to me before the clinic finally started functioning properly again, Ethan explained during the formal presentation of the early detection program before the hospital's full board of directors. Among the first children identified through that early detection program was Sophie Dalton, a second-grade student whose mild, previously undiagnosed asthma would probably have worsened considerably during the following months, without the timely preventive intervention Ethan's program made possible. Because you checked my daughter directly at her school, we were able to begin treatment before the situation became serious, exactly the opposite of what happened to Mrs. Margaret, who had to wait until her crisis was already far too advanced, Sophie's mother told Ethan during her daughter's first complete follow-up appointment at the hospital clinic. Jessica Monroe, around her 18th full year working at Sullivan Hospital, formally assumed the role of Director of Patient Experience, a newly created position designed specifically to continuously oversee whether the empathetic triage protocols and guaranteed waiting time standards she herself had helped design years earlier continued functioning effectively through the inevitable staffing changes and daily operational pressures that every hospital constantly faced. Every 6 months, we fully review our waiting time data broken down by type of medical insurance. precisely to make sure we never again develop the kind of systematic disparity that affected Mrs. Margaret that afternoon. Jessica explained during a results presentation before the board, almost 2 decades after the original incident that had so profoundly defined the entire course of her own professional career. Barbara Sterling, continuing her leadership on the board of directors for more than 2 full decades, reflected on the entire road traveled during a final interview for the regional documentary, and offered a synthesis that captured, from the complete perspective of the years that had passed, the deepest meaning of that shared institutional journey. What we learned, in the most painful way possible, is that no institution can simply assume its founding values will automatically survive over time without active work and constant vigilance, Barbara said. Mrs. Margaret's story reminded us that genuine institutional memory requires deliberate effort, requires people willing to document, to question, and to honestly confront any deviation from those values, no matter how long it takes before that vigilance finally produces the necessary results. Robert, in the final years before his own full retirement from work in Milwaukee, ultimately decided to move permanently back to Chicago, settling only a few blocks from the same Pilsen building where he had grown up with his mother, finding in that return a way to remain close both to Claire and to the hospital that represented, for their entire extended family, considerably more than simply a successful medical institution. After all these years, I felt I needed to return exactly to where this whole story began, not only out of nostalgia, but because I want to continue contributing actively, with whatever time I have left, to protecting everything we have built together as a family and as a community, Robert explained to Claire after completing his move back to Pilsen. Robert, formally establishing himself as a permanent volunteer with the Senior Adult Companion Program he himself had founded years earlier, dedicated his retirement years to personally accompanying dozens of elderly patients who arrived at the emergency department without relatives present, offering them exactly the kind of active advocacy and comforting companionship he himself would have wanted to be able to offer his own mother during those first devastating hours of waiting decades earlier. Every time I accompany an elderly patient who arrived alone, with no one actively advocating for their needs, I think of my mother sitting in that same hallway, waiting for hours without anyone believing she deserved priority care, Robert said during another interview for the regional documentary, already 71, but maintaining the same dedicated energy that had characterized his entire participation in the hospital's institutional reconstruction over the previous 2 decades. The completed documentary, ultimately titled The Doctor's Daughter, and premiered at several regional documentary film festivals in the American Midwest, before receiving broader distribution through streaming platforms specializing in public policy and community health content, generated considerable additional impact during the months after its release, attracting the attention of hospital administrators from across the country interested in understanding more deeply the specific protected community governance model Sullivan Hospital had successfully developed over more than 2 decades of sustained institutional reconstruction. I hope anyone who watches this documentary understands that my grandmother's story is not simply about one particular hospital in Chicago, Claire said during the documentary's premiere screening, held precisely in the same main lobby of the hospital where the entire story had begun decades earlier. It is about a universal lesson that every institution, in every community, needs to learn and actively protect. The genuine dignity of every person should never depend on their outward appearance, their economic capacity, or whether anyone happens to recognize their name at the right moment. Sophie Dalton, the child identified early through Ethan's preventive screening program, grew up over the years repeatedly hearing, both in her own home and during educational school visits to the hospital's community museum, the complete story of Mrs. Margaret, developing by adolescence a considerably deeper understanding of the real meaning of that family history that had indirectly helped protect her own medical well-being during her early childhood. When I was little, I never fully understood why my mother always told us the story of Mrs. Margaret every time we came to the hospital for my regular checkups, Sophie confessed to Ethan during a follow-up visit when she was already 16 and seriously considering her own future university options. Now I understand that story is exactly why this hospital works the way it does. The reason you screened me directly at my school before my asthma became too severe. Exactly, Sophie. And I hope that, no matter what career you eventually choose to follow, you carry that same lesson with you. Dignity and genuine care for others always deserve to be actively protected, generation after generation, no matter how much time has passed since the original events that taught us such an important lesson. Jessica Monroe, during her final years before seriously considering her own eventual retirement after more than 2 full decades of dedicated service to the hospital, decided to devote considerable additional time to formally preparing a much younger triage coordinator to eventually succeed her as Director of Patient Experience, transmitting, with the same meticulous patience that had characterized her entire professional redemption, both the specific technical protocols and the particular ethical sensitivity that had defined her leadership throughout all those years of shared institutional reconstruction. I want whoever eventually succeeds me to understand, with the same clarity I developed after my own mistake with Mrs. Margaret, that no system of protocols, no matter how well designed, can completely replace genuine empathy toward each individual patient, Jessica explained during one of her formal mentoring sessions. Protocols exist precisely to protect patients during the moments when pressure and professional exhaustion inevitably threaten to erode the genuine empathy we should all offer consistently, without needing additional structural reminders. Christine Mitchell, reflecting on the 2 full decades that had passed since her original appointment as interim executive director, offered, during a final interview for a retrospective article published by a national magazine specializing in public health administration, a synthesis that captured, with the full perspective of all those years of continuous leadership, the deepest meaning of the entire institutional transformation she had led. When I took this position, only weeks after the incident with Mrs. Margaret, I felt an overwhelming responsibility to immediately correct everything Walker had broken during 8 full years of improper management, Christine said. Over time, I understood that the real responsibility was not simply correcting past mistakes, but building structures robust enough that no future executive director, regardless of their own personal intentions, could ever repeat that same pattern of gradual erosion without being detected in time. I believe that after 20 full years of constant work, we finally built exactly that kind of lasting institutional protection. Claire, gradually assuming increasingly significant leadership responsibilities within the hospital's administrative structure, while Christine began seriously considering her eventual transition into an emerita advisory role similar to the one Carol had held during her final years of active involvement, developed, during those years of gradual preparation, her own vision for the institution's continuing future, combining profound respect for the traditions established by her great-grandfather and by her own grandmother, with genuine openness toward the innovations necessary to keep the hospital relevant to the changing needs of new generations of families in the Pilsen community. I want people, when I eventually assume complete leadership of this institution, to remember that we kept it exactly faithful to my great-grandfather's original values, even while we grew and adapted to changing times, Claire told Christine during one of their periodic long-term succession planning conversations. I think that combination, solid tradition, together with necessary adaptation and constant ethical vigilance, is exactly what has allowed us to overcome both the original crisis and any future challenge that may emerge during the next decades. One quiet Sunday afternoon, exactly 25 years after that devastating confrontation in the 3rd-floor hallway, Claire, now formally assuming the role of hospital executive director following Christine Mitchell's complete retirement, walked alone to the small community cemetery in Pilsen, where both Frank and Margaret Sullivan were buried beside one another, with simple headstones reflecting the same genuine modesty that had defined both of their entire lives. Great-grandpa, Grandma, I want you to know that everything you built is still growing, still protecting exactly the same values you established, each in your own particular way, Claire said, sitting on the grass beside both graves, with the fresh flowers she always brought during her periodic visits, carefully placed on the ground. The hospital now has structures that prevent anyone from ever manipulating it the way Walker tried to, and every new generation of doctors and nurses knows your full story, thanks to the work so many people devoted over the years to making sure it was never forgotten. The wind moving gently through the trees surrounding that particular section of the cemetery was the only sound accompanying Claire's words, as she continued speaking with the same natural ease she had developed through years of similar visits, both to her grandmother's grave and, more recently, while understanding with increasing depth the combined legacy of two different generations of the same family who had, each in their own way, protected and transformed the same community medical institution. I hope with all my heart that I am honoring exactly what both of you would have wanted to see, even though the road here was considerably more painful than any of us would have chosen if easier alternatives had been available, Claire continued. But I also know, with the same certainty both of you demonstrated throughout your own full lives, that sometimes the deepest pain ends up being exactly what an institution needs in order to remember, with complete clarity, why it truly exists. Because in the end, after 25 full years of sustained reflection on every detail of that complete family story, Claire understood that the real question posed by the entire experience, and which every future generation of doctors, nurses, and administrators at Sullivan Hospital would have to answer for themselves through their own daily decisions, had never simply been how to prevent specific future financial irregularities, although that concrete structural protection had undoubtedly proven absolutely decisive to the institution's sustained success over the quarter-century that had passed. The real question, considerably deeper and more enduring, had always been whether every person, from the most senior physician to the newest volunteer, was willing to consistently, and without any additional condition, offer exactly the same respect and the same urgent attention to every patient who crossed those doors, regardless of outward appearance, regardless of type of medical insurance, and without anyone needing first to recognize whose child they were before they could finally deserve the genuine care every human being deserves from the very beginning, without any prior condition being necessary. Back at the hospital that same afternoon, Claire passed through the second floor before going up to her office and found Ethan standing in the hallway beside a young woman holding a small child in her arms, her face tense with worry. "Ma'am, I understand that you're worried about the cost, but I want you to know something with complete clarity. Matthew's full treatment is covered, without a single exception, no matter what his insurance says," Ethan was saying, bending slightly to bring himself to the child's eye level as the boy watched him with a mixture of curiosity and fear. "We'll handle the paperwork right here, right now, so you don't have to worry about anything except taking care of your son." The mother, her eyes filled with tears of relief, briefly squeezed Ethan's hand before a nurse led her toward the treatment room. Claire approached, waiting until the conversation had ended. "Everything all right?" she asked, although she already knew the answer from Ethan's expression. "Everything's fine. It's exactly the kind of case the fund exists for, Claire. A single mother without adequate insurance, a child with pneumonia who needed immediate treatment. 25 years ago, they might have made her wait for hours while someone reviewed her ability to pay. And today we treated her first and handled the money afterward, exactly the way it should always be." Claire smiled, feeling that the brief exchange, without any special solemnity, said considerably more about what they had managed to build than any formal anniversary ceremony ever could. "Are you coming to the documentary screening tonight?" she asked Ethan as they walked together toward the elevator. "I wouldn't miss it for anything, although I still feel a little embarrassed seeing myself on camera talking about what Mrs. Margaret meant to me. I'm embarrassed too, and I'm her granddaughter." The screening of The Doctor's Daughter was held that same night in the hospital's main lobby, with folding chairs arranged in front of a temporary screen installed beside Frank's portrait and Margaret's plaque. Robert arrived early, helping seat the older attendees in the first rows, while Grace Oliver, now 91 but still remarkably lucid, occupied a place of honor reserved especially for her. "I never thought I would end up seeing my own face on a movie screen, sweetheart," Grace told Claire before the screening began, with a nervous laugh that could not completely conceal her emotion. After the screening, during the brief question-and-answer session that followed, an older man raised his hand from the back of the lobby. "I'm an administrator at a community hospital in Detroit. My question is simple. If Walker had been more careful, if he had never left such a clear documentary trail. Do you think the corruption would have continued indefinitely? Claire considered the question for a moment before answering. Probably yes, for longer than we would like to admit. But that is exactly what we learned. We cannot depend only on corrupt people making documentary mistakes. We need structures that make corruption difficult from the beginning. And we need people like Carol, willing to pay close attention, even when no one else seems to be watching. And what if my own institution is never lucky enough for someone to recognize the right person in the right hallway? Then don't depend on luck, Claire replied without hesitation. Build the system so every patient receives that same respect, without needing to turn out to be anyone in particular's daughter. That is the real lesson, not the specific anecdote. The man nodded slowly, taking notes in a small notebook, while the rest of the audience applauded with a genuine warmth that filled the hospital's main lobby completely. Robert, now settled in his new apartment 4 blocks from the building where he had grown up, continued every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon to personally accompany elderly patients who arrived alone at the emergency department. One October afternoon, he found an 84-year-old man sitting in the waiting room with a cane resting against his knee and an expression of quiet discomfort that Robert recognized immediately. "Good afternoon, sir. My name is Robert. I'm a hospital volunteer. Did you come alone today?" "My wife died 3 years ago, son. I don't have anyone left to call to come with me to things like this. Then I'll stay with you, if you don't mind. We'll make sure someone is keeping track of your case while you wait." The man, surprised by such a simple gesture, accepted with visible relief on his face. "Why do you do this, if you don't mind me asking?" "Because my own mother once waited alone for almost 4 hours in a hallway of this very hospital, without anyone bothering to check how she was doing," Robert replied, sitting beside him. "I don't want that to happen to anyone else, if it is within my power to prevent it." Robert remained beside the man for the next 2 hours, until he was finally called for his evaluation, offering exactly the same kind of quiet companionship he himself would have wanted to be able to give Margaret on that devastating afternoon decades earlier. Claire, closing her office door that same night after a particularly long day, paused for a moment in front of the 2 plaques in the main lobby, Frank's and Margaret's, before finally turning off the building's lights. "Good night to both of you," she said softly, a small ritual she had developed without intending to over the previous years whenever she was the last person to leave. "We continue tomorrow." And the next day, exactly as every morning for more than 70 years, Dr. Frank Sullivan Community Hospital opened its doors at 6 o'clock, ready to care for the first family in line without any distinction of last name or appearance. 2 weeks later, the annual gathering of Frank Sullivan Scholarship recipients was held in the hospital's main auditorium, an event considerably less formal than the documentary screening, where former and current scholarship recipients shared a simple dinner and updated one another on their own professional paths. Jessica Monroe, seated beside the young triage coordinator she was preparing to succeed her, pointed toward the back of the room. "Do you see that woman over there, the one talking with Sophie Dalton? That's Danielle, the first nurse I personally trained after the incident with Mrs. Margaret. She now runs triage at a community hospital in Rockford, using exactly the same protocols we designed here. And how do you know she's actually using them, and not just saying so to be polite? Because she calls me every time she has a question about a borderline case, even after 10 years of running her own department. That is the real sign, Alexandra. People who truly absorb the lesson keep asking questions instead of assuming they already know everything." Alexandra, the young coordinator, made a mental note of that observation, while Sophie Dalton, now 19 and in her first semester of public health studies, approached the table where they were sitting. "Nurse Monroe, I wanted to thank you for something you may not even remember," Sophie said. "When I was little, you were the one who coordinated my first screening at school, the one that detected my asthma before it became worse. I remember it perfectly, Sophie, and I'm so happy to see what you've become. I want to specialize in exactly what you do, designing systems that protect patients before someone has to make a mistake in order for people to realize something is wrong." Jessica felt her eyes grow slightly moist, something that did not happen often after almost 2 full decades working in the same hospital. That is exactly the kind of work this world needs, Sophie. When you finish your studies, come find me. We'll have a place for you here, without any doubt. On the other side of the auditorium, Ethan was talking with two more recent scholarship recipients, both still in high school, showing them photographs of his own office on his phone. "Did you really grow up here in Pilsen, just like I did?" one of the teenagers asked, with a mixture of disbelief and renewed hope. "Exactly the same. And if I was able to become a doctor thanks to this scholarship, after a doctor from this very hospital examined me at my own elementary school when my mother could not afford even a regular appointment, then you can do it too, with no excuse stopping you." Claire, observing that scene from her own table, felt that the entire auditorium, filled with different generations connected by the same institution and the same shared history, represented, considerably more eloquently than any formal speech she herself could give, exactly the kind of legacy both her great-grandfather and her own grandmother had dreamed of building, each without fully knowing the other for most of their own lives, yet united decades later by the same room full of young people who would never again have to wonder whether they deserved dignified medical care simply because of the neighborhood where they had been born. Barbara Sterling, formerly retired from the chairmanship of the board but present that night as guest of honor, approached Claire toward the end of dinner, carrying a printed copy of the state hospital transparency legislation she had helped promote years earlier. "Do you know what was hardest about testifying before that legislative committee, Claire? It wasn't explaining the numbers, not even explaining how Walker had manipulated the financial incentives. The hardest part was when a senator asked me directly why the board had not detected it earlier. And what did you tell him? I told him the truth, that we trusted good faith for too long without demanding enough structural transparency. That we learned, in the most painful way possible, that institutional trust needs constant verification, not just good intentions. That senator ended up voting for the law precisely because he understood we were not there to point fingers at anyone except ourselves." Claire carefully put away that document, promising herself, as she did every year during that same scholarship gathering, to personally review with Alexandra and the new Ethics Compliance Committee every one of the hospital's financial indicators before the month ended, a ritual that over time had become as deeply ingrained as the 6 in the morning coffee Christine Mitchell still prepared out of habit whenever she visited the hospital in her role as Emerita advisor. When the gathering ended and the final guests said goodbye, Claire, Ethan, and Jessica helped put away the auditorium chairs, exactly like any other group of employees closing another community event, with no visible hierarchical distinction between the executive director, the staff physician, and the director of patient experience. "Do you know what Mrs. Margaret once told me when I was still a child?" Claire said while folding a chair. "She told me a hospital is never measured by how large its building becomes, but by how small people's fear feels when they finally walk through the door." Ethan stopped for a moment, considering that sentence. "I think that's why we keep doing this, Claire. Not because of the building, or the awards, or even the plaque in the lobby. We do it so that every morning, someone like Mrs. Margaret walks through that door and feels from the first minute that someone here cares about them." The auditorium lights went out shortly afterward, and Dr. Frank Sullivan Community Hospital fell silent until the following morning, when, exactly at 6 o'clock, it once again opened its doors to receive the first family in line, never asking, before treating them with complete dignity, whose daughter they were. Grace Oliver, before Robert accompanied her back to her own apartment that same night, paused for a moment beside Margaret's plaque, leaning slightly on her cane. "Margaret, sweetheart, I hope you saw all of this tonight, wherever you are," Grace said softly, almost like a private prayer. "All these young people talking about becoming doctors and nurses because of what happened to you. Who would have thought that phone call, the one from the day I found you on your kitchen floor, would end up leading to all of this?" Robert, waiting patiently a few steps behind her, approached when he saw that she had finished. "Everything all right, Grace?" "Everything's fine, son. I was just saying goodbye to your mother, like I always do before I leave here." She took the arm Robert offered her, and the two of them walked together toward the exit, passing through the now empty lobby, where the two bronze plaques, Frank's and Margaret's, continued softly reflecting the dim light of the hallway's nighttime lamps. Outside, the cool October air greeted the final visitors leaving the hospital that night, while the building's lights remained on in the emergency department, where the night shift continued treating whoever arrived, never first asking how much they could pay or whose daughter they were. Inside, in the same third-floor hallway where everything had begun 25 years earlier, a young nurse whom none of the people present that night yet knew by name was completing the initial evaluation of a newly arrived elderly woman, alone, with no family member present, wearing a worn coat and with her hands trembling from the cold outside. The nurse, following exactly the protocol Jessica had designed years earlier, immediately activated the community companion alert, and within minutes, a volunteer from the program Robert had founded sat beside the elderly woman, taking her hand with the same quiet warmth that had defined, from the beginning, everything the institution had learned to protect. No one in that hallway yet knew the woman's full name, or whose daughter she was. But, for the first time in the hospital's entire history, that no longer mattered at all in determining the quality of care she was about to receive. That, in the end, was exactly the difference 25 years of constant work had managed to build. A hospital where dignity no longer depended on a lucky recognition in the right hallway, but on an institutional commitment so solid that no elderly woman, no matter how alone she arrived, would ever again have to wait for someone to recognize her last name before finally receiving the care she deserved from the very first moment. And that difference, sustained every morning for a quarter of a century, was exactly the kind of inheritance Frank Sullivan, decades earlier, without ever being able to anticipate the exact circumstances that would finally make it necessary, had always wanted to leave his own community. Not a building, not a family name carved above an entrance, but the quiet certainty that, in that specific place, no one would ever have to prove who they were in order to deserve, from the very first minute, to be treated with complete dignity.